Thank you, Allison. Can everyone hear me? Welcome, Oliver.
Thank you.
I feel like you're becoming a regular here at the 92nd Street Y. It's great to have you.
Too much, perhaps.
Never, never. So this exhibit is a very powerful exhibit. I've walked through the art gallery and seen people spending time studying the photos and reading the stories. In fact, I took my own son through here and found it to be a very moving experience. So I'd like to start just by talking a little bit about how you pulled everything together. And what struck me as I was walking through the exhibit is that genealogy is a very interesting exercise. For most people, it means you find the oldest living relative that you can, you ask a few questions, you hear some truth, you hear some stories, you ask other people, you triangulate, and eventually you figure out your history. For people of European Jewish background, though, the exercise is a more difficult one. Often the people who have the knowledge are gone. Whole branches of the family might be gone. Documents might be gone as well. In your case, not everyone was gone, but some of the people who had the knowledge didn't share it, didn't feel comfortable sharing it, didn't want to talk about it. And yet, here in this room, you've put together a pretty comprehensive story of a group of people who went through a pretty horrific experience. I'm wondering if maybe just as a starting point, you can talk about how you were able to fill those holes in given all of the challenges that you had to face.
It really starts when my mother turns 51, because up until that point, she did not speak a word about her past. So up until that point, all the information that I had was really in tiny morsel form, words breathed here, words breathed there. In fact, I didn't know that, for example, my mother's adoptive father wasn't my real grandfather until the day he died. That's a perfect example of how secrets can suddenly, in one moment, expose themselves. So once my mother started to talk, I was able to very gradually flesh out more information. Her own information is kind of limited too. So then, as the years rolled on, I had the advantage of advancements in technology. Google, I mean, fantastic starting point. Every now and then I would Google the names of particularly her father, Pavel Rosenfeld, and I'd usually be taken to this dentist in Brazil, who he wasn't. And for example, just through Google, I think it was only during the pandemic, can you imagine, I discover that there is this cache of documents that I refer to, I think it's over here, hidden in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, that about 15 documents relating to specifically to my family, but revealing really kind of hugely important information, not least in my grandfather's case, birth certificate, marriage certificate. I mean, you have no idea how important these documents are, because they are evidence that these people lived. This is what the Nazis were trying to erase, not just the lives, but any trace that they ever lived. So it's very, very moving to find an original 1907 birth certificate. And then also this incredible affidavit that my grandmother signed in 1946 that reveals exactly how her husband, my grandfather, was murdered. I mean, the details, there it is. So isn't it incredible, this struggle for information for decades and decades and decades, and it was there all along, resting in an archive in America. So the technology is something that has been an extraordinary help, and obviously, it really is like putting your foot on the accelerator. The information just sort of comes up, and then if it comes up, it will give you a lead, and you can run with it very quickly. But in lots of cases, I mean, while you say that this is a comprehensive story, it sounds like one, but you can appreciate that there are immense gaps in it. My mother spent 2 years in the Warsaw Ghetto. We know very little about that. There are a few incidents. My grandmother was working in a factory. There were at least 4 textile factories in the ghetto. And funnily enough, when the ghetto was razed, was liquidated, those factories remained, because obviously they were beneficial to the Third Reich, so they weren't going to torch them. But my mother has this memory of being at her mother's feet while she was at a sewing machine, obviously doing her best to stay out of harm's way. But the memories, I mean, she was very young, the memories are limited, and my grandmother certainly didn't share such information with us, or particularly with her. But going back a couple of years, I mean, the first 2 years of the war, 1939 to 41, up until the time that they are essentially captured and deported to the ghetto, we don't know anything about. So there are huge gaps. Then on my father's side, almost no information at all, to the point of not even knowing what my paternal surname, real surname is. We have Schwierstick, but that's actually a Polish Gentile name that was already adopted as things started to become difficult. We actually don't know. I mean, imagine a very prominent Warsaw Hasidic family, almost all wiped out, 20 uncles and aunts and all their family, no idea.
So I want to pick up on something that you just mentioned, which is the affidavit that your grandmother signed. And in your book, you talk about the fact that the reason she likely signed the affidavit was that she needed to get a death certificate so that she could then go on and live the rest of her life. And one of the things that struck me was, it at least read to me as if there was a question in your mind as to whether the affidavit was truly describing what had happened, or was her best guess at what happened just so that she could get the documents that she needed. And what struck me about that was this issue, again, that we've been talking about, which is that you were never able to have that conversation with your grandmother to find out which was the case. Was this truly what happened? Was it an educated guess? Was it something that she just had to say in order to get the documents that she needed? What was it like as you were uncovering this story for you to have the conversations with your family members about what you were finding? Was there resistance that people had to those conversations? Did, for example, your mother, you said that she started to open up. Did it just come out in a flood, or was it something that happened more slowly?
So where this history is concerned, it's quite extraordinary. My mother is actually quite a reserved, cool cat, I would say. She doesn't, I mean, she can be extremely emotional in other areas, and in some areas around this history she can be too, but she can also be quite prosaic. And this is quite deliberate. She says herself that in order to deal with this history, she looks at it as if it had happened to someone else. So in that way, she can be perhaps a little bit more reserved and circumspect. That's for sure. Yeah.
And as you started to uncover this family history, how did it change your own perspective on who you were? You mentioned, for example, that the man that you thought was your grandfather, you found out at the very end of his life was not actually your grandfather. Was that something that was disorienting? Did it change your perspective on the world?
I would say yes, yes, and yes. It's, I mean, you're playing, let's call a spade here. You're playing a kind of roulette if you play this game. And I can understand that an awful lot of, most people in my position don't talk about it. And I completely understand that position. It's not, there are no rules. We're all trying to navigate an inheritance that nobody wants or chooses, for sure. So for me, it's just manifested in such a way that I was the reverse of that. I absolutely had to know what my identity is, effectively, because it's undermined. Growing up in London, you have an accent that matches where you're living and born, but has absolutely no relation to your family. And yet they don't really explain what their original life or life of origin is. In fact, it's all hushed up. It's kind of discombobulating, to say the least. So when you come across certain nuggets, I remember as if it happened yesterday when I was 10 years old, discovering, it was the day my grandfather died. I was 10 years of age, and my little mind had worked out that my mother was older than her parents had been married, and a little light bulb went off, and how does this work? And I mean, forget the idea of sex out of marriage. I'm 10 years old, I don't know what sex is. And I just burst into tears. It was the only possible reaction I could have. I couldn't digest or calculate or have any understanding why such a significant fact would be withheld. And the most galling thing was that everybody else knew. It was like, so I'm the youngest. Like, did you forget? Or were you trying to protect me? What part of this story did you think I wouldn't be able to handle? So it's a perfect example of the kind of the risk you play with secrets and the risk you play uncovering secrets. So as things went on, there were the very obvious issue I had was when I discovered this first document from Yad Vashem, which was my grandmother's testimony, which she had made in 1977, just 2 years before her second husband died, giving some information about the death of her husband, my grandfather. And my mother knew nothing of this. All she was ever told was that he was arrested at the factory and disappeared. So I had to tell my mother the circumstance of her father's death. That's quite a big thing to have to do. I'm English, so I go for understatement. I'm sort of English. So that was difficult. And, my mother never knew her father. She was 7 months, I think, when he was taken away and murdered. But what she resented was not being told by her mother. I mean, in 1977, my mother was already a mother with 3 kids. I think I write in the book that she could have withstood the truth. So that was difficult. And then the story was repeated a little bit after I found these documents with the affidavit that really kind of pinned down the details, and having to present that to her, again, difficult tasks, but important because it's the antidote to the secrets. You carry the secrets, and that creates one set of circumstances, one kind of pain, and then you tear off the plaster and reveal the truth, you're going to have another kind of pain. But it's a better kind of pain, I think.
And broadly speaking, would you say that your family shares that point of view, that that's a better kind of pain, or are there parts of your family that wish that you hadn't uncovered all of this and left well enough alone? So
surprise, surprise, we don't talk very much about it. It's our culture, you know. Keep saying that.
And that's British culture, Jewish culture?
Well, yes, the British certainly don't talk about anything unpleasant, right. You know, because that would involve feelings, which they don't do. So that's one side of it, but not really. I mean, we're so un-English as a family. I promise you. Try and pretend the accent's different. You know, we really culturally are not English. No, it's growing up. It's the Holocaust legacy that defines this behavior, where the cultural norm is not to talk about it. So if you don't talk about it, there is little impulse to change that, because that's your culture. I keep saying that my brother in LA, for example, he's 60, he's 5 years older than me. I think we've had kind of 4 or 5 conversations about our legacy, 4 of which have taken place in the last 18 months.
And now that you're having these conversations, even if they're infrequent, are you finding him more interested?
Yeah, it's been transformational. Anyone, including with my family, anyone that comes to this exhibition comes away with more than they started with, and it's been a revelation for my family. Honestly, I can't tell you. For my mother, I mean, I'm still sort of digesting it a bit, mainly because, you know, I am an activist, so my work will never be done. My mother is not an activist. She's someone who is still living a life as a Holocaust survivor. It's a kind of something that we can only guess at.
Yeah.
Whereas for her, there were these 2 major revelations with this exhibition. The first being that seeing her whole life spread out in one exhibition, literally the first photograph, the day she was born, and then there's one with me a few years ago. She's already, I think, 80, probably something like that. Suddenly, her whole, this whole aura of survivor guilt just disappeared. A whole lifetime of it. And it's a huge thing, survivor guilt.
Yeah.
I mean, physically, she remembers being back in Łódź after the war, you know, a Jewish child alive, and the looks she got, you know, why are you alive when my child isn't? It's extraordinary. So you carry that,
Yeah.
and on it goes as you come to England and you discover that your parents' friends are all survivors, many of whom had lost children. So you become an object of both sadness and delight. And a child should only be an object of joy,
Right.
an object of love.
And speaking of potentially unpleasant truths, as you were digging into your family's history, were there pieces of information that you discovered that were either particularly disturbing to you or that you chose not to include in the exhibit?
Yes and yes. There are bits of information that are truly awful, that are awful in the sense that they are inhuman, undignified, and yet, this is the Holocaust we're talking about, people did anything to survive. As I keep saying, heroes don't always come wearing Superman outfits. They come in all sorts of guises. And one could say that just to survive the Holocaust as a Jewish person, regardless of what you did, you are a hero. That's one definition. It's so hard to pass judgment, but I would say that if you were in a position, if you had to resort to the worst kind of betrayal or criminality to survive, then, and you did survive, you have a whole lifetime to make amends, and if you don't, then actually somehow that says a lot about your character, full stop, Holocaust or not. So I know I'm speaking in a cryptic sense, but yes, there was an awful incident, and I chose not to include it because there are family members alive today who don't know about it.
I want to pivot a little bit from your family's story to the exhibit itself. You've now shown the exhibit in Ireland, and now you've shown it here in New York. Have you found the response to it to be different in those two places?
Yes. So the obvious difference is that there basically aren't any Jews in Ireland. There are 2,500 Jews. There's probably more Jews in your local supermarket on Monday morning than there are. I'm not joking. If you think about it, the population of Ireland is about 5 million, 2,500 Jews. Most Irish people haven't met a Jew unless they've read, Charles Dickens or William Shakespeare.
Right.
Those may be the only Jewish characters they have come across. And of course, in both cases, they're fictional. So that's the first huge difference. So we've come from a Jewish desert to the motherlode, okay, in New York. And that's, even just setting up the exhibition, to give you an idea, I think in the time we were setting up, something like 3 people came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm a Holocaust survivor." To give you an idea, we have 2 Holocaust survivors in Ireland.
Wow.
And we had 3 just coming in for the opening. So the cultural difference couldn't be wider. But I would say, interestingly, the advantage of showing this in Ireland was that it came across as something truly exotic, a part of history that Ireland was not involved in. Some, but not that much education available in Ireland on the Holocaust, not sort of taught in depth by any measure. So we were, for all sorts of reasons, we were overwhelmed by the response in Ireland. I mean, it had never, an exhibition, I am reliably told, an exhibition like this had never been put on ever in Ireland. Can you imagine? So you go from that kind of exotic situation to a kind of meh here. Not quite, but you know, there are several Jewish museums. It's a story that in many ways is familiar. So that's a...
And what was the response when you mounted this? I mean, in addition to feeling that this was a story that people hadn't heard told in this exact way, what were the reactions that you got from people after they went through the exhibit?
In Ireland?
Yeah.
Well, one of the most encouraging words that I heard on numerous occasions, people came up to me and said, so these were people, either strangers or, I mean, some strangers sought me out. Dublin is really small. It's very easy. I'm an art dealer, I run a gallery, you can find me. So sometimes people would just turn up, which is kind of very disconcerting because we run our gallery by appointment only. It's like, what do you want? So they would come and just sort of very sweetly communicate how moved they were. But on numerous occasions I heard the following line, Oliver, I never knew. Now, it doesn't refer to the history. They were aware. They never knew about the detail, the depth, how this story has such a long tail, all the nuances, the depth of loss. It's hard to communicate. And that I found deeply encouraging. And also, I mean, we did a number of events. We would have, you know, on every occasion you could hear a pin drop. And very often I'd look out of the corner of my eye and someone would be crying. And you knew that this story is a universal story, that it had tapped into some private grief that has nothing to do with the Holocaust. That's kind of amazing.
You know, as I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking about the Holocaust, obviously, and it occurred to me that when I was born, the Holocaust was relatively recent history. I calculated when I was born, the Holocaust was roughly as long ago as the year 2000 is to us now. And as I was growing up, there were lots of Holocaust survivors. You heard the stories told. And we're getting to a place now where we're losing that generation. And there will come a time where even the generation that knew that generation will be gone. And I'm wondering how you think that we can keep the horrors of something that's as singular as the Holocaust from just becoming another tragedy in history, the Black Death, the Spanish Inquisition, whatever it is, and to keep the story fresh and meaningful so that the lessons can be learned by future generations.
So just to start with the very last thing that you said, I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not a great one. I don't buy into this. It's a kind of idealistic fantasy of learning lessons, because we don't learn lessons. We just don't. You know, given what's happening in the world, I'm wondering, that the whole world of Holocaust education looks like abject failure to me. I'll give you an example. The day before the election US election in 2016, I drove to Derry from Dublin in the pouring rain. To give you an idea, it's kind of 4.5 hours in the pouring rain each way to talk on this subject to about 30 students in a library in Derry in the north. That's the north of Ireland. And I love to talk to people in the north because of the Troubles, they are so politically, they have so much sort of political acumen. They're so sensitive. They ask, they listen in a way few people do. They understand about intergenerational loss. Anyhow, so I do this work because I need to do it. I'm just compelled to do it. And I drive back again. And I sort of go to sleep. It's been a long day. And I put the TV on. And Trump's been elected. And I think, why do I bother? It's part of me. All I think we can do, because we don't learn lessons, is as societies, we can try and teach empathy, because that's something that needs to be taught, funnily enough. We can also, if we have mature democracies, we can put the kind of guardrails in place that make the dismantling of democracy impossible, which is what we haven't done. I mean, clearly we haven't done that. But learning lessons is, for me, as far as I can see, is a pipe dream.
You've written more recently about some of the challenges that you've encountered in Ireland today, given what's going on in the world. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what your experience has been like over the past several weeks.
In Ireland, so it's been difficult, I would say. I think it's been difficult I haven't met a Jewish person anywhere in the world who doesn't say that life feels exactly the same as it did on the 6th of October. I think that's whatever your political instincts, your opinions, your views, for us, it's just very difficult to be Jewish right now. I think I can't put it more plainly than that. In Ireland, it's been difficult in many ways. There has been in recent decades a natural leaning towards supporting the Palestinians, which would be just fine if it wasn't out of all proportion. So one of the things that I say is that, human rights, if you believe in human rights, this is not an a la carte choice, right? It's not human rights for some and not others. So if you are a Uyghur or Rohingya or Yazidi, I would ask, what is wrong with the quality of how you've been oppressed that there aren't hundreds of thousands of people marching for you? I don't understand it, but of course I do. And I can't help it. I come from a Holocaust family. When I see an imbalance in such expression of outrage and an imbalance of empathy, people coalescing around a cause, in many cases, I'll say it out loud, to promote their own careers. Simon Sebag Montefiore, a very kind of famous English writer, calls them moral nullities. You know, if you don't have any skin in the game, why can you not show empathy for Jewish suffering? And you know, I call them out. We have Holocaust Memorial Days every year. Where are you?
In one of your recent op-eds, and then I want to make some time for other people to ask questions, you talk about the fact that the Holocaust happened incrementally. And you talk about how it started with language, and language led to policy, and policy led to worse policy, and eventually we know what happened. As you look at the world and you look at some of the challenges that Jews are facing today, the fact that certain things that even a month and a half ago were inappropriate to say in public, now people are saying proudly and loudly, does it worry you that we're on a similar trajectory, or how do you view the progression of things today, the incremental progression now versus what you've learned about how it progressed historically?
It's the question, isn't it, Seth? If you're a European Jew, particularly who has this trauma in your DNA, you're looking at the scale and you're going, well, where does this fall exactly? You know, in 1938 in Poland, now there were already what I call Nuremberg Light. There were anti-Jewish laws in Poland brought in 1935 already. Funny that the Polish government doesn't mention that so much. Okay, so it was already kind of, I would say, tricky, but 3.5 million Jews in Poland. You can imagine as the Nazis were growing in power, and since, you know, remember, their first aim was to expel Jews. So it was completely out of sync to think that they would invade countries with more Jews if they don't want Jews. That's just completely nonsensical. So how many conversations went around Jewish tables going in 1938 going, or even the beginning of 1939 going, so, you know, if Hitler does come, you know, what's he going to do, kill us all?
Yeah.
So completely unimaginable. If you talk to Holocaust survivors, very often they will say, we couldn't even believe it when it was happening to us. It's so unimaginable was it. So unfortunately, we live in a post-Holocaust world. So it's not, it's no longer science fiction horror. It's something that can happen again. I don't know where this figures. If I could find a country with no anti-Semitism in it, I'd move there, and I tell you where it is. Okay, you could come too. Where do you go? I mean, these are the questions we're having. Where do you go? So one thing I'm not, you know, friends of mine have very sweetly said, you know, are you keeping your head down? Literally, are you keeping your head down? And I say, no, I'm not keeping my head down. I'm not going into hiding. That's what my mother had to do. I am not doing it, okay? So in a sense, now I'm not taking stupid risks.
Right.
But I am coming out swinging. Democracy has to be protected, and it is the duty of each and every individual living in a democracy to protect it. It's not divine right. It's incredibly fragile, as you can see. So I would very much like to know where this ends. because it seems to be beginning.
You know, it reminds me of a story. I have an uncle whose mother fled Germany in the early 30s, and the rest of her family stayed, and they all were killed. And I asked my uncle, how is it that your mother knew to leave and no one else did? And what he said was that my mother was a pessimist. And in our family, the pessimists went to New York and the optimists went to Auschwitz.
Yeah. That's very neatly said. It's horrifying, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that pleasant note, are there questions that anyone has?
Do you still speak Polish?
I don't speak Polish. I never. That was it's a really interesting question because part of the reason that I have this fancy English accent is because our parents wanted us to be English people. They wanted us. So what do? They send us to an expensive English school with a quota for Jews. That's going to work, isn't it? You're going to blend in nicely.
I didn't know that existed in England.
Not officially, but have a look.
I was asking the question because I have a Russian mother, so I was supposed to learn Russian after I was born, but it wasn't possible. My father was half Jewish,
Right.
and fortunately he forced me later on to study Russian, which openly better perspective.
Right.
And another question I had, did you read Raoul Hilberg's work on the Raoul Hilberg?
No, I haven't read, but I need to. Yeah.
He was studying with my late husband at Columbia.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And when we met him, my late husband asked him, do you have any special method, have you observed any way Jews could save themselves? So his reply was, they did the right thing in the right moment.
That sounds about right to me. Yeah.
And I worked for 23 years for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I was in charge of Holocaust tracing in Eastern Europe, Second World War, so I know more.
I'm sure. Yeah. Great work.
My great aunt perished in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
father-in-law came from Hamburg when he was 4 in 1937, and not uncommon story of his father coming first, family going, and his wife's family ended up in Paris, and they did not go. They stayed because they felt they were too old to move, and they're younger than I am now. And it was astounding when we were at the Holocaust Memorial in Paris, and I don't know if you've seen it.
I have,
with
yeah.
the pillars with
Yes.
names, and we saw my husband's great-grandparents' names, because the Germans kept great records of everything. And when we were there, my son was, I think he was in high school at the point, and I took a picture because I thought we should show it to my father-in-law, and somebody came up to me and said, go up to the archivist in the library, and they will give you the records. And we have everything, the deportation papers, where they ended up, and it was the most enormously moving thing for us to see it. And then we went to the house they lived in Paris, which had been knocked down, but I wanted to see the street. But it was pretty amazing. And my father-in-law, who's 92 now, was a child, but he still holds a lot of the stories. And I found the best way to talk to him is if he's in the backseat of the car, which is the way I often know that you get your own kids to tell you stories when there's no eye contact.
Yeah.
I know that as a mom and now as a daughter-in-law, and we were driving up to see my son at college, and he was in the back seat, and it was upstate New York, and it was kind of a dreary, snowy day, and he talked for 3.5 hours. And I'm so sorry I didn't put my phone on
Yeah.
to record him, and he's too wise to do that now, when I ask him questions, but it's very powerful.
So you can't say, Grandpa, sit in the back. No, he'll twig. Yeah.
He's more interested in sitting in the front now,
Right.
directing my husband's drive.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting when we get him to talk that way.
For sure. Yeah.
Thank you
Good
for
for you.
sharing all this. It was incredibly moving.
Good. Thanks.
Not the child of survivors, but I grew up in a community where many of my parents were.
Did you have a question?
I did. First question, was it your grandfather's death that prompted your mother to start talking? You said she started talking at 51.
No, funnily enough, it was the death of her second husband, not my father, and the birth of her first grandson, which happened within a 6-month period. And she can't quite, she's not quite sure exactly the impulse other than to know that it simply was time to go back. And of course, if you followed the story, I went back with her for the first time to Poland, which was a very, very moving time. Hard. Well, I've done my best to articulate it, but I'm very, very pleased I was able to do it. It's the one and only time that I've been to Poland, funny enough. Although I am about to receive Polish nationality. I applied for it.
And is that because you're the child of a survivor?
No, absolutely not. The only reason I wanted to do it, and I couldn't get my paperwork in time, was to be able to vote against law and justice in Poland.
Wow.
And in fact, they managed it without my vote, which I was really, really pleased about. And, you know, I'm just going to vote again next time. So that was the impulse. Yeah. And also I had, although she's not ambassador anymore, I had the rather childish thought that I had a number of clashes with the now former ambassador to Ireland, the Polish ambassador to Ireland, who was a really kind of staunch law and justice kind of stooge. I mean, ridiculous, and kind of looked. I've got a number of friends in the diplomatic community. I mean, they would quietly tell me how embarrassed they were by her. But if I had got my act together and my paperwork together and my passport, she was the one who was going to have to give it to me.
Oh.
Yeah.
You missed your opportunity in 2
Yeah,
ways.
I have to now figure out what the politics of the new ambassador are. I still might get my moment.
You have a question?
It's not really a question, but it's a feeling. You were brought up Jewish.
Yes, I'm Jewish.
Your mother had become Catholic during this whole thing.
For a very kind of short period of time. My mother was Catholic, I would say, for 3 years.
And the reason for that, just for...
Well, the reason for that was, so for long parts of the war, she was looked after by a family nursemaid who had stayed loyal and who my grandmother paid. And so it was, obviously for safety reasons, it was wiser to bring my mother up as a Catholic.
But then she obviously felt the need to go back to her Jewish roots and bring...
It wasn't a question of a need. At the end of the war, when she discovered that her mother she was told that there were 2 aunts looking after her, the nursemaid and her mother. She referred to them both as aunts. So when she discovered that one of the aunts was her mother, not her favorite aunt by any stretch, it was absolutely heartbreaking. And then to boot that she was Jewish as well, because again, she'd been brought up to believe that Jews were very, very bad. That was not what you wanted to be. So that was a whole new, fresh trauma for her. But then, you know, when they came to London, well, even before that, they spent 1.5 years back in Poland. It was very dangerous for Jews still. She reclaimed her Jewish identity because that's... Interestingly, my grandmother didn't renounce that. You know, it was secular for sure, atheist for sure, but still, they were prominent in the Jewish community. So their Jewish identity was really, really important. So similarly, I mean, we are secular atheist Jews, but we are Jews. That's what we are.
And maybe just to wrap up, I feel like we could speak for hours about your family.
You haven't got hours?
I'm sure everyone here does. But I want to just come back to the story that you briefly glossed over just now about when you went back to Poland. And what I thought was particularly moving in the book was when you talked about what it meant to your mother to walk into Auschwitz, but then to walk out of Auschwitz, and to do so with her son. Can you describe what that experience was like?
I can. I can remember it really, really clearly, because at that stage, I hadn't been in a position to do this kind of research. So when she was thrown off a train, we always assumed that it was destined for Auschwitz, because in terms of just raw probability, that was the most likely destination. But then you start actually doing the research, and again, with the help of Google, being able to trace the line and even find the spot where she was thrown off. The train was heading west towards Germany. So it would have been Buchenwald or Sachsenhausen or a host of slave labor camps. The outcome would have been the same. She probably wouldn't have been gassed, almost certainly not, but she would probably have been shot on the first day. Not where you want to be as a 5-year-old. So we believed, when we were in Poland, we believed that Auschwitz was where she was destined. So it was, hugely emotionally freighted. But there was, I try my best to use humor where I can, to just, as a safety valve, to just release some of the tension. So when we arrive, this is 1990, we arrive outside Auschwitz, there is a kiosk there. And I didn't know, it looked like you had to buy tickets to get in. So my mother, who has Polish, goes up. So I shout to her, "Mum, if they're looking for tickets, just tell them we've paid already." So she actually laughed. So she grabs my arm and says, "So finally I walk through the gates of Auschwitz." It's a kind of big moment. But out again. The sense of, Auschwitz is a place that's, I think it's very, very hard to find any real sense of triumph. It's very, very, for obvious reasons, although one can say, look, we're living here. We're in this place that was programmed for our extermination. We're walking around, and where is this 1,000-year Reich? I don't see it. So in that sense, there is triumph, but such is the, I'm sure many of you have been to Auschwitz, but such is the intensity of horror and loss and grief focused on the annihilation of your family that you struggle to find that triumph. But, we found it walking out, got to tell you, because that was not supposed to happen.
And I guess to end our conversation, we can take that as perhaps the most important lesson, which is that as a people, we were able to walk out, or some of us were, and that here we are together having this conversation, and hopefully having learned the lessons, even if humanity doesn't more broadly, and imparting that lesson and making sure going forward that there's a future.
Yeah, it's the closest we get to justice, these sort of events.
And with that, I will say thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Seth. Thank you. There's one more there.
Will you take
There is talk of it going to Toronto next, so we will see. But watch this space. Perhaps, yeah.
If I can have your email, I have a cousin who could help.
Okay, that's very kind of you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.